Last time we completed the first chapter, Samadhi Path, which had sutras from 1 to 51. We now enter the second chapter of Yoga Sutras. It is Sadhana Pada, and it has sutras 52 to 106. In the first chapter, Patanjali talks about definition of Samadhi, definition of certain important states one goes through before one reaches Samadhi, and a broad outline of some essential paths you can take in this journey. The first chapter is more definitional and related to introduction of Samadhi. Second chapter talks about techniques to reach the state of Samadhi. So in this second chapter, sutras 52 to 106, we will look at techniques to reach the state of Samadhi. And this will be a short chapter. This session particularly will be a short one. You don't need much commentary. Patanjali is very open, very holistic. In this chapter, he brings to the center his own 8-step process, what is called Ashtanga Yoga, the 8-step process to reach the state of Samadhi. But he is not closed. He is very inclusive, appreciative of other paths, and he actually mentions many paths to the state of Samadhi. Just as we have seen in the first chapter, at one point he also talks about use of herbal ingestions, spiritual practices, mystical alchemical practices, along with other practices which were popular during his time. So in this chapter also you will see the same openness, the same holistic approach. While he puts forward his own approach of an 8-step process, he is very open and appreciative of other approaches. So let us go into it. He starts with introducing the approach to Samadhi called Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga is one of the forms of yoga. You have Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and similarly Kriya Yoga. If you wish to learn, you can learn it from Ananda Sangha or Yogoda Satsang or Sri M. 3 authentic sources to learn Kriya Yoga. It's a very ancient technique mentioned in Bhagavad Gita and in Autobiography of Yogi also. Patanjali starts with defining Kriya Yoga. And Kriya Yoga essentially is based on pranayam, mantra, visualization, and some preparatory physical exercises. Patanjali starts with defining Kriya Yoga as the first technique towards Samadhi, and he says, penance, study of the self, and abiding in the Ishvara. Ishvara, as he defines it, is the Purusha of the Sankhya, not the psychic being or the central being of Sri Aurobindo, nor the one all-pervading anchor of Shankara. So he introduces Kriya Yoga and he says, penance, study of the self, and abiding in the observer, the Purusha of the Sankhya, constitute Kriya Yoga. And then he says, Kriya Yoga helps overcome obstacles to Samadhi. And what are these obstacles, he lists out 5 obstacles. Ignorance, wrong identification of the self by identifying oneself as the surface self, the persona, not going to the authentic self and the spiritual self. And this brings us to the idea of the self, that when you say usually myself, we talk about the persona. Very few go to the deeper levels of the authentic self. So there are 3 selves then: the surface self, the authentic self, and the spiritual self. And at the center of the spiritual self is the psychic being or the observer. It depends upon which path you follow. So not identifying with the psychic being or the Purusha and identifying with some other part of the personality as oneself is a wrong identification of self. Attraction to objects of pleasure and aversion to objects of pain and clinging to life are the 5 obstacles. So he starts by saying Kriya Yoga is a path to lead to Samadhi. It helps you overcome all the obstacles to Samadhi and thereby attain Samadhi. And obstacles include the 5 elements. And he says, out of these 5, he takes up one by one and he says, ignorance or avidya is the foundation of everything else. That at a fundamental level, we don't have the correct knowledge. And therefore, all other mistakes arise from that wrong foundation. Ignorance is the foundation of other obstacles. And these obstacles may be dormant or unconscious. They may be active, but moderately active. They may be fully active or they may be intense based upon the nature of obstacles. So there is this full menu of obstacles. And then he says, ignorance is wrong knowledge that makes us see the temporal as eternal, the impure as pure, the painful as pleasant, and something which is not our real self as our real self. So he defines ignorance. So these 5 are the first 5 of the second chapter, where he talks about Kriya Yoga being a path to Samadhi, Kriya Yoga helping us overcome obstacles being 5 in nature, and then he goes on to define the first one, ignorance. And ignorance is the master obstacle, which is the foundation of other obstacles. And it is the wrong knowledge where we see the temporary as eternal, impure as pure, painful as pleasant, and not our real self as our real self. We see the persona instead of looking at our spiritual self or the center of the spiritual self. And this is a journey of the self, from the surface self to authentic self to the spiritual self to the center of the spiritual self. Psychoanalysis can greatly enrich the process knowledge when we go deeper into ourselves. There is a kind of a block arrangement of knowledge where when we come to very elemental level of knowledge, the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Hindu psychology, the yogic psychology is very powerful, very good. Then above the elementals, there is a block where the process knowledge of psychoanalysis is very precious. And then comes the macro area where again the Eastern knowledge is very good and they fit in very well. Psychoanalysis can be used to enrich the process knowledge which is not there in these Eastern scriptures. And psychoanalysis also can take the elemental knowledge and the macro knowledge from these scriptures. Yoga Sutra also. Patanjali goes on to say, wrong identification of the self is like confusing the seer and his power of vision. We confuse ourself with our faculties or our attributes. We don't see ourselves apart from our attributes and faculties and our structure. And this cannot happen unless we are in the state of pure observer. And then he talks about other obstacles. He says pleasant experiences lead to raga, translated as attraction or attachment, a mild form of addiction. Painful experiences lead to dvesha or aversion, also translated as dislike, rejection, vairagya. And there can be attachment to painful experiences also, which he does not talk about, but we know in psychoanalysis, there can easily be a pathological attachment to pain. The entire area of masochism opens up. And similarly, the entire area of addiction to pleasure opens up when we talk about raga. So there is a lot psychoanalysis can bring in here. Then he says, there is a clinging to life, and the smallest element of clinging to life exists even in the sages. And Paramahansa Yogananda talks about how his guru, when he knew he is about to die, he cut off all the connection between his soul and the body shivered at that time. And he says, he quotes Patanjali to say that a minor attachment to life, to the bodily existence, remains even in the sages, and it has to be cut off before one is really free. These obstacles are subtle and have to be overcome by working on their roots. Very self-evident that we are dealing with subtle entities, abstract entities, esoteric entities in the mind, not something concrete in the outer world. So it's an inner journey, inner work, not outer engagement and outer work. So it's an inner science. And the entire Hindu genius has been, not entire, but a large proportion of Hindu genius across history has been dedicated to this inner science. Yoga Sutra itself is a very good example of attainments in inner science. So if we go back and look at how psychoanalysis can be used, study of the self anyway we do in our own way in psychoanalysis. We don't go into abiding in Ishvara, and that's a very powerful tool for healing, which is slowly coming up in mindfulness. That we just be mindful, we strengthen our observing ego, and the healing accelerates far more than otherwise. This sutra can be used to enrich the healing potential in psychoanalysis by strengthening the observing ego. This is a goal samadhi. There is a goal difference. Psychoanalysis does not accept that such a goal is possible, and therefore there is a goal paradigm difference, and this sutra cannot be used in psychoanalysis. This 54 can definitely be used because it can lead us to the concept of the three selves that I talk about: the surface self, the authentic self, and the spiritual self. And the center of spiritual self being the Purusha or the psychic being. This can be used as a cognitive base in psychoanalysis to enhance stoicism and help healing through stoicism. Ignorance, and this ignorance is against reality acceptance. When we say reality acceptance, we are trying to overcome this ignorance. Ignorance of seeing something temporal as eternal. Denial of our temporality, denial of our mortality. Impure as pure by projection of omnipotence. Painful as pleasant in masochism. And our surface self as our real self because of lack of insight. Confusing of our attributes and faculties for ourselves. Confusing part for the whole object. Seeing through the addiction to certain experiences. seen through of terror and pathological avoidance, unreal avoidance of painful experiences. The attachment to the body, which leads to annihilation anxiety, death anxiety, and pain anxiety. The three fundamental anxieties at work all the time in our psyche. And the subtlety of the world, the inner world, does not mean behavioralism is not useful. Behavioral therapy is useful, but we are into the subtle realm. And if we go more subtle than psychoanalysis goes, we'll end up into tantra or yoga. We'll end up in the world of prana, chakras, nadi, different bodies, the spiritual self, and rare experiences of spirituality and mysticism, and finally samadhi. This is something psychoanalysis is yet to incorporate or accept or leverage to widen and complete itself.